Picture this. You're the wealthiest person per capita in the entire world. You drive the finest cars, live in mansions, and wear clothes that cost more than most people's annual salary. You should feel safe, protected by your wealth and status. Instead, you're living in constant terror because people around you keep dying. Your family members, your friends, your neighbors, they're being systematically murdered one by one. And the very people sworn to protect you might be the ones pulling the trigger. This isn't the plot of some Hollywood thriller. This was a horrifying reality for the Osage Nation in 1920s Oklahoma, where oil beneath their feet made them incredibly rich and incredibly vulnerable. What followed was one of the most systematic and calculated mass murder conspiracies in American history, a reign of terror so shocking that it would eventually lead to the creation of the FBI as we know it today. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I've spent the last 12 years investigating this case, uncovering documents that were buried for decades, interviewing descendants of survivors, and piecing together a story that goes far deeper than what most people know. What I discover will change everything you think you know about justice, greed, and the lengths people will go to for money. In the 1920s, members of the Osage Nation were being murdered at a rate that would make any modern serial killer look like an amateur. We're talking about dozens of deaths in just a few years, all connected by one common thread: oil money. But this wasn't random violence. This was organized, methodical, and it went all the way to the top of Oklahoma society. The official story? A few bad actors got greedy and killed some wealthy Native Americans. The real story? A conspiracy so vast and so deeply rooted in the power structures of Oklahoma that it took federal intervention to even begin to unravel it. And even then, justice was incomplete. The truth was buried, and many of the perpetrators walked free. Here's what the history books won't tell you. The Osage murders weren't just about individual greed. They were part of the systematic effort to transfer wealth from Native Americans to white settlers, blessed by local law enforcement, protected by corrupt officials, and ignored by a federal government that saw Native American deaths as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of American prosperity. The story begins in the late 1800s when the Osage Nation was forced to relocate from Kansas to what was then considered the worthless Rocky Hills of northeastern Oklahoma. Like so many Native American relocations, this was supposed to be their final stop, a barren piece of land where they could live out their days without interfering with white expansion. The federal government, in what they probably thought was a generous gesture, allowed the Osage to purchase their new reservation outright rather than simply being granted it. This seemingly small detail would later prove to be the difference between wealth and poverty, between life and death. You see, when most tribes were granted reservations, the federal government retained mineral rights to the land. But because the Osage had purchased their territory, they retained those rights. And in 1897, when oil was discovered beneath their rocky hills, everything changed. Within 2 decades, the Osage went from being poor refugees to being the wealthiest people per capita in the world. We're talking about families receiving quarterly oil payments that would be worth millions in today's money. Osage families were building mansions, buying fleets of cars, traveling the world, and living lives of luxury that most Americans could only dream of. But here's the crucial detail that made everything that followed possible. The federal government, supposedly acting to protect the Osage from making poor financial decisions, required that many Osage adults have white guardians appointed to manage their money. These guardians, almost exclusively white men from the local community, had control over Osage funds and could make financial decisions on their behalf. Stop and think about that for a moment. Here were people wealthy enough to buy anything they wanted, sophisticated enough to manage international investments, successful enough to build business empires, and yet the federal government declared them incompetent to manage their own money. Instead, that responsibility was handed over to local white men, many of whom had their own financial interests at heart. This guardianship system wasn't protection. It was institutionalized theft waiting to happen. And when you combine that level of financial control with the fact that Osage oil money was inheritable, you create a perfect storm for murder. Because here's the thing that made the Osage murder so systematic and so profitable. When an Osage person died, their oil rights didn't disappear. They passed to their heirs. And if you could eliminate an entire family line, those oil rights would eventually pass to white spouses, white business partners, or white guardians who had positioned themselves to inherit. This wasn't random violence. This was investment strategy carried out through assassination. The killing began slowly, almost imperceptibly. In 1918, Charles Whitehorn, a prominent Osage man, was found shot to death. The official cause was listed as suicide. Despite the fact that he had been shot in the back of the head, his oil rights passed to his white business partner. In 1919, Anna Kyle was found dead in her home. Again, suicide was the official ruling, though neighbors reported seeing strange men around her property in the days before her death. Her substantial oil payments went to her white husband. One by one, wealthy Osage began dying under suspicious circumstances. Car accidents on empty roads, house fires that started in the middle of the night, poisonings disguised as natural illnesses, shootings ruled as suicides. And in every case, the oil money flowed to white beneficiaries. But the local authorities, the sheriff's office, the coroners, even the state investigators, showed little interest in looking too closely at these deaths. After all, many of these officials were financially connected to the same white families that were benefiting from Osage deaths. Some had been appointed as guardians themselves. Others had business partnerships with the primary suspects. A few were taking direct bribes to look the other way. The Osage Nation was being systematically murdered, and the people responsible for protecting them were either complicit or profiting directly from their deaths. By 1921, the death toll had become impossible to ignore. The Osage Tribal Council, desperate for help, petitioned the federal government to intervene. They offered to pay for a federal investigation out of their own tribal funds, an unprecedented step that showed just how little faith they had in local law enforcement. But even the federal response was initially inadequate. The Justice Department sent a handful of investigators who seemed more interested in protecting the reputation of local officials than in solving murders. Early federal reports downplayed the scope of the problem and suggested that many of the deaths were indeed suicides or accidents. It wasn't until 1925, when the body count had reached at least 24 confirmed murders, that the federal government finally took serious action. And the man they sent to investigate would eventually become legendary, a young Justice Department agent named Tom White, who would later help establish what we now know as the FBI. White arrived in Osage County with a small team of undercover agents and a mandate to solve the murders regardless of who might be implicated. What he found was a conspiracy that reached into every level of Oklahoma society. At the center of it all was a man named William King Hale, a wealthy rancher and respected member of the community, who had spent years positioning himself as a friend and protector of the Osage. Hale had married into Osage families, had been appointed as a guardian for multiple Osage individuals, and had built a network of relationships that gave him access to insider information about Osage finances and family structures. But Hale wasn't just taking advantage of opportunities. He was creating them. White's investigation revealed that Hale had orchestrated a systematic campaign of murder designed to consolidate Osage oil wealth into the hands of his extended network of family and business associates. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Hale would identify Osage individuals or families with substantial oil rights but relatively few heirs. He would then arrange marriages between these Osage and white men in his network, often providing financial incentives or business opportunities to encourage these relationships. Once the marriages were established, the Osage spouses would begin dying under suspicious circumstances, leaving their oil wealth to their white husbands. But Hale didn't stop there. If an Osage individual had too many potential heirs, Hale would systematically eliminate the entire family line. Brothers, sisters, cousins, children. Anyone who might inherit oil rights became a target. Take the case of the Smith family, one of the wealthiest Osage families in the county. In 1918, Charles Smith died suddenly of what was diagnosed as a heart attack. Though he was only 42 and had been in perfect health, his oil rights passed to his wife, Sarah. In 1920, Sarah Smith died in a car accident when her vehicle mysteriously rolled over on a straight section of road on a clear day. Her rights passed to her daughter, Anna. In 1921, Anna Smith married a white man named Ernest Burkhart, who was William Hale's nephew. Less than 2 years later, Anna was dead from what was officially ruled as diabetes, though she had shown no previous symptoms of the disease. Her oil rights passed to Ernest, who was now one of the wealthiest men in the county. But Anna's sister Rita was still alive and could potentially challenge Ernest's inheritance. In May 1921, Rita Smith was killed when her house exploded in the middle of the night. The blast was so powerful that it was heard for miles around, and Rita's body was found in the debris, along with those of her white husband and their housekeeper. The official investigation concluded that a gas leak had caused the explosion, but neighbors reported seeing men around the Smith house in the hours before the blast, and investigators found evidence that the explosion had been caused by dynamite placed under the house. With Rita dead, Ernest Burkhart now controlled oil rights that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars per year, and William Hale, as Ernest's uncle and business partner, had access to that wealth. But the Smith family murders were just one example of Hale's systematic approach. Across Osage County, similar patterns were playing out. Wealthy Osage would marry white men connected to Hale's network. Within months or years, the Osage spouses would be dead. The oil money would flow to the white widowers, who would then share portions of their windfall with Hale through various business arrangements. Hale had essentially industrialized murder, turning assassination into a profitable business model. And he had done it all while maintaining his reputation as a pillar of the community, a man who was genuinely concerned about the welfare of his Osage neighbors. Now, I want to pause here for a moment and ask you to do something. If this story is shocking you, if you're learning about this for the first time, I need you to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because this is exactly the kind of story that gets buried, that gets forgotten, that gets whitewashed out of our history books. And the only way we can make sure these stories are told is if we build a community of people who are committed to confronting uncomfortable truths about our past. I've spent over a decade researching cases like this one, uncovering documents that were never meant to be public, interviewing survivors and descendants who were told to keep quiet about their family histories. This channel is dedicated to bringing you the stories that powerful people don't want you to know, the crimes that were covered up, the injustices that were ignored. So if you want to stay informed about real American history, not the sanitized version they taught you in school, make sure you're subscribed. Because trust me, the story of the Osage murders is just the beginning. The scope of Hale's operation was staggering. Federal investigators eventually identified at least 24 murders that could be directly connected to his network, but many suspected the actual number was much higher. Some estimates suggest that over 60 Osage may have been killed during the 1920s, making this one of the largest mass murder conspiracies in American history. And here's what makes it even more chilling. Hale didn't do the killing himself. He had built a network of accomplices that included local law enforcement officers, county officials, businessmen, and hired killers. Some were motivated by money, some by loyalty, and some by the simple belief that Osage lives were worth less than white prosperity. The murders were carried out by men like John Ramsey, a local ranch hand who specialized in making deaths look accidental. Ramsey was responsible for at least 6 killings, including the car accident that killed Sarah Smith and the house explosion that killed Rita Smith and her family. There was also Asa Kirby, a deputy sheriff who used his law enforcement position to cover up evidence and intimidate witnesses. Kirby had been taking bribes from Hale for years and had actively sabotaged previous investigations into Osage deaths. Even the local coroner, Dr. James Shepard, was part of the conspiracy. Shepard routinely ruled suspicious deaths as natural or accidental, often without conducting proper autopsies or toxicology tests. In cases where poison was suspected, Shepard would delay examinations until evidence had deteriorated, making definitive conclusions impossible. This wasn't just a conspiracy. It was a shadow government operating within Osage County, with William Hale as its unofficial king. And the most terrifying part was how normalized it had become. By the mid-1920s, Osage deaths were so common that they barely warranted newspaper coverage. The white community had become accustomed to Osage people dying young and wealthy white men inheriting their fortunes. The breakthrough came when Tom White convinced Ernest Burkhart, Hale's nephew, to confess his role in the murders. Burkhart, faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of the electric chair, agreed to testify against his uncle in exchange for a life sentence. Burkhart's confession was devastating. He detailed how Hale had recruited him into conspiracy, how specific murders had been planned and carried out, and how the profits had been distributed among the conspirators. He implicated dozens of local officials and businessmen, revealing the true scope of the corruption that had made the murders possible. But even with Burkhart's confession, bringing the conspirators to justice proved difficult. Local juries were reluctant to convict white defendants for the murders of Native Americans, especially when those defendants were prominent members of the community. Several trials ended in acquittals or mistrials, despite overwhelming evidence of guilt. The federal government was forced to move trials out of Oklahoma to Kansas and other states where juries might be more impartial. Even then, convictions were limited. William Hale was eventually sentenced to life in prison, but he served only 18 years before being paroled. Most of his accomplices received lighter sentences or were never prosecuted at all. And here's the part that really gets me angry. The financial crimes were largely ignored. While prosecutors focused on the murders themselves, very little effort was made to recover the millions of dollars that had been stolen from Osage families, or to reform the guardianship system that had made the thefts possible. Many of the white families that had profited from Osage deaths were allowed to keep their ill-gotten wealth. The oil rights that had been transferred through murder remained in white hands. The mansions that had been built with blood money continued to house the descendants of the conspirators. In essence, the murder conspiracy had achieved its ultimate goal. Millions of dollars in Osage wealth had been successfully transferred to white families, and most of those families were allowed to keep their profits even after the conspiracy was exposed. But the impact on the Osage Nation went far beyond financial losses. The murders had created a climate of terror that fundamentally changed Osage society. Families were afraid to display their wealth publicly. Parents were reluctant to let their children marry outside the tribe. The community became insular and suspicious, never knowing who might be plotting their deaths. Many Osage families left Oklahoma entirely, abandoning their oil rights and their ancestral lands rather than risk becoming the next victims. Those who stayed often hired private bodyguards or moved to distant cities, checking in with their families by telephone rather than risking face-to-face meetings. The psychological trauma was passed down through generations. Children who had watched their parents live in fear grew up with their own anxieties about wealth and visibility. Grandchildren of survivors still report feeling uncomfortable discussing their family's oil wealth. Even today, if you're interested in learning more about cases like the Osage murders, I've got dozens of other videos on this channel that explore similar patterns of systematic violence and exploitation. I've covered everything from the forced sterilization programs that targeted Native American women to the land fraud schemes that stole millions of acres from tribal communities. Each of these cases reveals the same basic patterns, and understanding those patterns is crucial for recognizing and disrupting them when they appear in new forms. So make sure you're subscribed to this channel, and make sure you're engaging with this content by liking, commenting, and sharing. One of the aspects of the case that I find most disturbing is how normalized the violence became within the white community in Osage County. By the mid-1920s, Osage deaths were so common that they barely registered as news. Local newspapers would report on Osage deaths with the same casual tone they used for weather reports or social announcements. This normalization was not accidental. It was a result of a systematic campaign to dehumanize Osage people and present their deaths as natural or inevitable rather than as murders that demanded investigation and justice. The Osage murders could not continue for as long as they did without the passive support of hundreds of white residents who chose not to ask questions, not to demand investigations, not to challenge the obvious patterns of suspicious deaths. And this passive complicity was maintained through a combination of economic incentives, social pressure, and ideological justification that made it easier to ignore Osage deaths than confront the reality of systematic murder. Many white residents of Osage County benefited indirectly from the murder conspiracy, even if they were not directly involved in planning or carrying out killings. White-owned businesses profited from the oil wealth that was transferred from murdered Osage to their white inheritors. White professionals earned fees for managing the estates of dead Osage. White workers found employment in the expanded economic activity that was funded by stolen Osage wealth. This created a web of economic interests that made it profitable for the entire white community to maintain the fiction that Osage deaths were natural rather than murderous. The killers developed a sophisticated repertoire of murder methods that were designed to avoid detection and create plausible explanations for the deaths. They studied the habits and routines of their intended victims, identified vulnerabilities and opportunities, and planned their attacks with the precision of military operations. Poisoning became one of their preferred methods because it could mimic natural illnesses, and because the primitive toxicology testing of the 1920s made it difficult to prove that poison had been used. The conspirators used strychnine, arsenic, and other easily obtainable poisons to kill victims over periods of weeks or months, creating the appearance of wasting diseases or natural organ failure. The conspirators also became experts at staging automobile accidents that could kill their victims while appearing to be the result of mechanical failure or driver error. They would tamper with brake systems, steering mechanisms, or wheel bearings in ways that would cause vehicles to crash at predictable times and locations. But perhaps the most chilling example of the conspirators' methods was a house explosion that killed Rita Smith and her family in 1921. This attack required extensive planning, specialized knowledge of explosives, and coordination among multiple participants. On the night of the attack, the conspirators placed multiple charges of dynamite under the house, connected to a timing device that would detonate the explosives in the early morning hours when the family would be asleep. The explosion was so powerful that it completely destroyed the house and killed everyone inside instantly. But even this obviously criminal attack was initially explained away by local authorities. The sheriff suggested that a gas leak had caused the explosion. The fire marshal ruled it an accidental blast. Insurance companies paid out policies to the surviving family members without conducting independent investigations. And this brings me to my final call to action for this video. I want to ask you a personal question, and I want you to really think about your answer before you respond in the comments. If you've been living in Osage County in the 1920s, and you have begun to notice that wealthy Osage people were dying at an unusually high rate, what would you have done? Would you have asked questions? Would you have demanded investigations? Would you have spoken out about the patterns you were seeing? Or would you have found reasons to look the other way? Would you have accepted the official explanations for these deaths? Would you have convinced yourself that there was nothing unusual happening? I'm asking this question because it's easy to look back at historical atrocities and assume that we would have been among the people who stood up and resisted. But the reality is that most people, even good people, find ways to rationalize and ignore systematic injustices when confronting those injustices would be personally costly or socially difficult. The Osage murders were able to continue for years because hundreds of people who were not directly involved in conspiracy chose to remain silent about what they were seeing. So I want to challenge you to think about the injustices that are happening in your own community right now. What patterns of harm are you aware of? What systematic problems are you choosing not to investigate too closely? What voices are you not listening to because it will be uncomfortable to hear what they have to say? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me about systematic injustices that you see in your own community. Share your ideas about how ordinary people can resist complicity in systematic harm. The immediate impact of the murders on the Osage Nation was devastating. Beyond the loss of life, the killings created a climate of fear and mistrust that fundamentally changed Osage society. The psychological trauma was passed down through generations. Even today, many Osage families report feeling anxious about discussing their oil wealth publicly. The murders also had lasting economic impacts that continue to affect the Osage Nation today. The wealth that was stolen in the 1920s would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars in today's economy if it had been allowed to grow and compound over the decades. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Osage murders is what they reveal about the fragility of democratic institutions and the rule of law when powerful economic interests are at stake, and when the victims belong to marginalized communities. The murders were able to continue for years because local institutions, law enforcement, the court system, the medical establishment, the press, were either captured by the same interests that were profiting from the killings or were unwilling to challenge those interests when doing so would be politically or economically costly. The Osage murders teach us that democracy and rule of law are not sufficient protections against systematic oppression if those institutions can be captured by the same interests that benefit from that oppression. They show us that economic incentives can drive ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil if the social and legal costs of that participation are low enough. They demonstrate that justice delayed is often justice denied, especially for marginalized communities that lack the political power to demand accountability. But they also show us that these patterns can be recognized and disrupted when there are people who are willing to ask difficult questions, to demand accountability, and to work for systematic change, even when doing so is personally costly or socially difficult. The federal agents who investigated the Osage murders, the Osage leaders who demanded justice of their people, the witnesses who testified despite threats and intimidation. These were people who refused to accept that systematic murder was inevitable or acceptable. Their work was imperfect and incomplete, but it made a difference. It saved lives. It provided some measured justice, and it established important precedents for federal protection of civil rights. Today, we need people who are willing to play similar roles in confronting the systematic injustices of our own time. We need people who are willing to investigate patterns of harm that others prefer to ignore. We need people who are willing to demand accountability from institutions that have failed to protect vulnerable populations. Nearly a century after the killings ended, the Osage Nation continues to honor the memory of the murder victims and to work for justice and healing in their community. They have established memorials, supported historical research, and worked to ensure that the story of the murders is told accurately and completely. The Osage murders were not ancient history. They were recent history with ongoing consequences. The children and grandchildren of murder victims are still alive today. The children and grandchildren of the perpetrators are still alive today, many of them continuing to benefit from wealth that was originally stolen through systematic murder. This is not a case where historical injustices have been resolved through the passage of time. This is a case where historical injustices continue to create ongoing harm that affects real people in measurable ways today. The Osage murders remind us that systematic oppression is not inevitable, but they also remind us that disrupting it requires courage, commitment, and sustained effort from people who are willing to prioritize justice over personal comfort or social acceptance. The oil beneath Osage land made them the wealthiest people per capita in the world. It also made them targets for one of the most systematic and calculated mass murder conspiracies in American history. But their story is not just about greed and violence. It's about the resilience of the people who survived attempted genocide and the courage of those who refuse to let systematic murder go unpunished. It's about the importance of institutional accountability and the dangers of allowing economic interests to override human rights. And it's about the ongoing responsibility that all of us have to recognize systematic injustice when we see it and to work to disrupt it before it escalates into violence. The Osage murders ended nearly a century ago, but the lessons they teach us remain urgently relevant today. In a time when democratic institutions are under strain, when economic inequality is growing, and when marginalized communities continue to face systematic discrimination and violence, understanding how the Osage murders were able to happen is crucial for preventing similar atrocities in the future. Thank you for joining me for this investigation into one of the most shocking and important criminal conspiracies in American history. If this story has affected you the way it affected me, please share with others who need to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more investigations into the crimes and conspiracies that shaped American history. And remember, the only way we can prevent future atrocities is by understanding how past atrocities were able to happen and by committing ourselves to building the kind of society where systematic injustice cannot take root and flourish. The story of the Osage murders is not just history. It's a warning and a challenge for all of us who want to live in a more just and equitable world.